Let us first begin our lecture with the vehicles that are used in parental preparation. Now, the main important vehicle that is used in the parental preparation are water, aqueous vehicles. They are the most common vehicles. When you talk about the aqueous vehicle, there are two types of vehicles that are being used. You have water for injection and sterile for water for injection. So, water for injection and sterile water for injection is being used. And when you have the other type of vehicles are non-aqueous vehicles that do not contain water. In that, you may be having these non-aqueous vehicles may be miscible in water. So you have water miscible vehicles, or they may be immiscible in water. In that case, you have water immiscible vehicles. So there are two types: water and non-aqueous vehicles. In water for injection, sterile water for injection, and water miscible and water immiscible. Let us go to the first category, that is water for injection. Okay, water for injection is the most frequently used water for the large scale manufacturing of injections. Water for injection is basically used for large scale manufacturing of injections. Okay, and they are also used for rinsing. Okay, that is rinsing means cleaning the equipments, cleaning the ampules, cleaning the container. For that purpose also it is being used. For if there is a large scale manufacturing where a large amount of water is being required, okay, then for that also it is being used, that is a water for injection. Now how it is prepared? It is prepared by two methods. It can be prepared by the method of distillation and it can be prepared by the method of reverse osmosis. Okay, these two methods you are already aware of. Okay, now what does these two methods do? Because of these two methods, it makes the water free from liquid, gas, and solid contaminants. So all the liquid gases and solid contaminants, whatever that are present in water, that have been removed. Along with that, it also removes the dissociated and undissociated substance. If there are some substances which are dissociated, that also gets removed, and if there are some substances which are undissociated, then those also get removed. Only thing that you have to remember, that undissociated substances like pyrogen are not removed because of distillation and reverse osmosis. Okay, so water for injection is not sterile, as well as it is not free from pyrogen. Okay, whereas sterile water for injection, which we are going to study further, is sterilized, okay, as well as it is free from pyrogen. Now what is a pyrogen? Okay, you know it very well. Just to revise, it is a substance which is produced by bacteria. Okay, just for example, endotoxins. Okay, so it is a substance which is produced by bacteria and it is responsible to produce fever, okay, when it goes inside the blood. So it is a substance which is produced by bacteria and it induces fever in a person. Okay, so those are the pyrogens. So if you give the sterile if you give water for injection directly to the patient inside the blood, then it may cause fever to the patient. Okay, please remember that. So water for injection are not sterilized, as well as they are not free from pyrogen. When you collect this water, okay, these are collected in a container which are free, okay, from pyrogen and which are already sterilized. In that container, usually you collect this water for injection. And after collection, they are used within 24 hours, right? Store it for a longer period of time and then use it. Within 24 hours, you have to use this water for injection. And the another thing of water for injection is the total solid content. The total solid content of water for injection is not more than 1 milligram per 100 ml. So this is something about water for injection, that it is used for large scale manufacturing. It is also used for rinsing of the products, cleaning of the, once the cleaning has taken place with the help of detergents, etc., then, and it has been washed, then the final rinsing is also given by water for injection. It is prepared by distillation and reverse osmosis. It removes all the contaminants, it may be solid, liquid, or gases, and it also removes the dissociated and undissociated substances. Only the undissociated substances like pyrogen are not being removed for it. You have to remember that the water for injection is not sterilized and it is also not free from pyrogen. Okay, we talked about what is a pyrogen, and then we have seen that this water for injection is usually collected in a sterile and pyrogen free container, and it is used within 24 hours after collection. and the total solid content is not more than 1 milligram per 100 ml. This is moving ahead with water for injection. Now, how will you determine the quality of water for injection? Whether the water for injection is of the desired quality or not. I have taken two tests over. There are many tests that have been performed. I've just taken two tests which have been mentioned in Lashman also. Okay. So first thing that you're going to determine is the total solid content of it. This total solid can be measured by the gravimetric evaluation. So you can do gravimetric evaluation. In gravimetric evaluation, what you do is you heat the water for injection. You totally remove the water because of evaporation, and whatever are the undissociated and dissociated, okay, organic and inorganic substances that can be weighed. So that is the gravimetric evaluation, where you determine the total solid content after evaporation of water that is present inside it. The second method that is used to determine is the electronic measurement of conductivity. Now, total gravimetric method is going to take a lot of your time. So, what you do is you use a conductivity meter, right? It consists of what? It consists of a probe. So, this is the probe, and it consists of a meter. So, what you do is you place this probe inside the water for injection. Supposing whichever water you want to test for conductivity, you place this probe inside the water. After placing this probe inside the water, what does this probe consist of? Okay, this probe consists of two electrodes. And what you do, in between these two electrodes, you apply the voltage, right? So voltage is applied in between these two electrodes, depending upon the resistance of water. So what is the resistance of this water? Depending upon the resistance of this water, and the resistance of this water depends upon what? It depends upon the undissociated and dissociated and any insoluble impurities that are present inside the water. Depending upon that, there is going to be resistance of water. Depending upon the resistance of water, there is going to be the drop in voltage. So this drop in voltage is going to be recorded over there. That is going to give you nothing but the conductivity per centimeter. Okay. So it depends upon the, as I told you, it depends upon what? It depends upon the ionic content of water. So how much ions, how much undissociated and dissociated impurities are present inside the water. Depending upon that, there is going to be the drop in voltage, and you are going to get what? You are going to get the conductivity. Okay. Now, as a rule, water for injection as a standard, it should not have. This is the most important line you have to remember, that water for injection should not have conductivity more than 1.3 millisem per centimeter. Okay. That is approximately 0.1 ppm of sodium chloride, right? So this is the unit for it is ms is nothing but millisiemens per centimeter, right? So the conductivity should not be more than 1.3 millisiemens per centimeter. The SI unit of conductivity is nothing but Siemens per meter, which you already know. The conversion is 1 millisiemens per centimeter is nothing but is equal to 0.1 Siemens per meter. Again, these units you don't have to remember that much. The only thing that you have to remember is water for injection. In whole of this, the sentence that you have to remember is water for injection should not have conductivity of more than 1.3 millisiemens per centimeter. So that is the most important unit that you have to remember. Okay. Also, the unit of conductivity is ohms, or it is also known as Siemens. Not that much important again. So this is about the two methods for determining the quality for water for injection. That is total solid content and determining the measurement of the conductivity of it. Now, if you there are as I told you, there are other methods also that determine the conductivity. Here are determine the quality of water for injection. Here are some of the specifications that are given, which are given in USP for water for injection. It talks about the description, that it should be colorless, clear, okay, odorless. It talks about the organic carbon that should be present, okay, not more than 500 ppb of organic carbon should be present. We talked about the conductivity at 25 degrees Celsius, okay, the conductivity should be less than 1.3 millisiemens per centimeter. Bacterial endotoxin, okay, should be present in limit, that it should be present less than 0.25 European units per ml. Okay, then it talks also about the microbial limits. So it says that pathogen just like Escherichia coli, okay, E. coli, Salmonella, okay, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Staphylococcus aureus, these should be totally absent, okay, from waterborne injection, okay, and the total aerobic microbial count should be less than 10 CFU per 100 ml. It talks about the acidity and alkalinity, okay, so it should not be acidic in nature, it should not also be alkaline in nature. It talks about the pH, which should be between 5 to 7. Okay, it talks about the ammonia content, which should be less than 0.2 ppm. It talks about the calcium and magnesium content, which also should be limited. Heavy metal should also be limited. There should be chlorides, that is, you are going to use limit test for chlorides for determining this. So it should also be in limits. Your nitrate should be in limits. Sulfates, again, you are going to employ your limit test for sulfates over here. That should also be in limits. The oxidizable substances should not be present, and also the residual evaporation, that is the solid content, should be less than 0.001%. So these are the specification of water. So the water for injection that you're going to use in production of your parenteral preparation should have all these specifications, should pass with all this specific. Moving ahead to the second vehicle that has been used, it is sterile water for injection. As I told you, water for injection is not sterile in nature, okay, and it is not free from pyrogen. Whereas sterile water for injection, which is given officially in USP, okay, should be sterile also. It is sterile also, and it is non-pyrogenic also. There is absence of pyrogen inside. Okay, and it is also distilled. So it is distilled, sterile, and non-pyrogenic. Okay, it is basically a container which is used for intravenous administration, right? So the substances, for example, solid substances, dry solid substances, those are to be diluted with a solvent and then given to the patient. So what you do is you use the sterile water for injection. From the sterile water for injection, you remove the water, you put it into the solids, you dilute it, and then you take it. Usually, it is a single dose container. If you see your water for injection, it is used in a very large quantity. Whereas sterile water for injection are present in the range of 10 ml in a container that is 10 ml or near about 1000 ml. Not more than 1000 ml is packed at one given moment of time. Okay, as I told you, it is basically used for dilution. आपने बहुत बार देखा होगा कि you have sterile water for injection, right? It has been used inside the body. The nurse, she comes and she injects the drug inside it. Okay, so drug has been ingested inside it, so the drug is getting diluted, and that diluted form of the drug then goes inside the body. This you must have seen many times in the hospital, which has been done. Okay, so it is basically used for dilution, and as it is going directly inside the body, no sterilization is going to take place after this. Whereas when you are using water for injection, only water for injection, then this preparation have to be sterilized later on. Okay, so sterilization process has to be carried out when you are using water for injection. Whereas sterile water for injection, they are directly ingested inside the body. Sterilization process is not carried out. Hence, no antimicrobials, no microbes should be present. Another thing that you have to remember in sterile water for injection, that no antimicrobial are added into it. Okay, so you don't add any antimicrobial agents into sterile water for injection. Okay, when you add antimicrobials into water for injection, those are known as sterile water for injection. Those are known as bacteriostatic sterile water for injection. Okay, so bacteriostatic sterile water for injection, what do they contain? They contain sterile water for injection along with the antimicrobial agent. Okay, So they should be free from microbes, but at the same time, no antimicrobial agent should be added inside it. Okay. So the pH that the pH that is been of sterile water for injection is in the range is 5.5. It is in the range of 5 to 7. Right? As I told you earlier, it is pyrogen free, so it contains less than 0.25 USP of endotoxin per ml. It does not contain, as I told you, any antimicrobial agent. The next thing that I told you, packed in a single unit. Okay, from 10 ml to 1 liter, it has been packed. Not larger than 1 liter is packed. Next, whereas water for injection, you can pack it in what do you call that, in as 1000 ml, or you can pack it in tanks also, whereby it is used for rinsing, etc. So in tons also you can pack. In gallons also you can pack your water for injection. Now this water is being used as a solvent, okay, as a vehicle or diluent, and it is already sterile. It is already sterilized, as I told you, and packed injectable medicine. So if you have sterile, if you have the material which is sterilized powder, which is already sterilized, which is already packed, okay, then this water for injection is added into it. It is diluted, and then it is given to the patient directly. So it is used for the diluent for sterilized packed injectable medication. Okay. It is used for reconstitution, as I told you earlier. So it is used for reconstitution of multiple antibiotics. But you have to remember that the total solid content of sterile water for injection is usually a bit higher than water for injection. The reason for it is because sterilized water for injection is wherever it is being prepared, wherever heating etc. is carried out of this water for injection, that you want to sterilize further. Okay, the leaching of solids may take place from the glass lined tanks. Okay, during sterilization, because we first prepare water for injection, and this water for injection is sterilized. Okay, this water for injection is sterilized, and this water for injection is sterilized in tanks which are lined by glass, and there might be leaching of glass that will take place, and that's why the solid content of sterile water for injection is a bit higher as compared to water for injection alone. Okay, this is something about sterile water for injection. This is the second vehicle that you are going to use. The next type of vehicle are non-aqueous vehicles. Okay, so we have studied about water for injection, that is aqueous vehicle. We studied about the sterile water for injection, that was also the aqueous vehicle. Now we are going to talk something about the non-aqueous vehicle. Now non-aqueous vehicles are basically used if the drug is prone to hydrolysis. So if the drug is prone to hydrolysis, then what you are going to, you have to eliminate water. So what you have to use is you have to use non-aqueous vehicles. Okay. Then the next is that and also when the solubility is a problem. If your drug is not soluble in water, and if it is soluble in some other non-aqueous solvent, also you can use non-aqueous vehicles. Care you have to take that should be non-irritating, it should be non-toxic, and it should also be non-sensitizing to the patient. In short, it should not exert any adverse effect, okay, either on the ingredient that is used in the formulation, or it should not have any adverse effect on the body of the patient. Okay, so that we have mentioned over here. So it should not have adverse effect on the formulation. It should not have adverse effect when it goes inside the body. The next thing that you have to see is that this non-aqueous vehicle itself does not have any pharmacological activity of its own. The next thing that it should be, this non-aqueous vehicle should be chemically stable at various pH levels. Another property that non-aqueous vehicle should have is it should be sufficient. It should have sufficient viscosity. Okay, because if it is very highly viscous, then it cannot be easily injected inside the body of the patient. Okay, so it should have sufficient viscosity so that it is easy to be injected inside the body. Okay, next thing, it should have fluidity at what? At the room temperature. Okay, so if it is fluid in room temperature, then and then only it can be given to the patient. Okay, and it should have a boiling point. okay, which is sufficiently high, so that the heat sterilization can be carried out of this aqueous vehicle. So if you have prepared something in a non-aqueous vehicle, you have prepared a formulation of non-aqueous vehicle, we are going to further sterilize it. Okay, so how we are going to sterilize this? With the help of heat, right? There are other methods also, but if you are going to sterilize it with the help of heat, then it should have a sufficient high boiling point so that it is going to remain stable in that heat. Okay, so these are some of the properties that are required from the non-aqueous vehicle. Let us see the types of vehicle, non-aqueous vehicle that have been used. You have two types of vehicle, as I have told you earlier. You have water miscible vehicles and you have water immiscible vehicles. Let us see the examples of water miscible vehicles. Okay, some of the examples are ethyl alcohol, dimethyl acetamide, glycerine, ethylene glycol, PEGs, that is polyethylene glycol, the molecular weight of 400 to 600. Polyethylene glycol at higher molecular weight are semi-solid in nature. Okay, hence molecular weight they are specifically mentioned, that is 400 to 600. Then propylene glycol. Okay, then N-butyl hydroxy ethyl lactamide. These are some of the water miscible solvents that can be used. There are some water immiscible solvents also that can be used. The examples are fixed oil, corn oil, basically most of the oils, that is fixed corn, cottonseed oil, peanut oil, sesame oil, ethyl oleate, isopropyl myristate, and benzyl benzoate. So these are some of the water immiscible solvents that can be used when you are preparing the parental products. The commonly used solvents, non-aqueous solvents, are polyethylene glycol and propylene glycol along with the fixed oil. Some of the examples, ethyl alcohol, which contains 40% ethanol, is used in the preparation of cardiac glycoside. Okay, when you are preparing cardiac glycoside injection, at that time ethyl alcohol is being used as a solvent. Then if you are preparing solution of barbiturates, okay, or you are preparing solution of certain alkaloids or certain antibiotics, then glycols can also be can be used as a non-aqueous solvent. So these are some of the examples, that is ethyl alcohol and glycols, where they can be used in preparation of an injectables. When you are going to select oils, then usually vegetable oils are usually preferred. The reason being because they are metabolized inside the body, they are liquid at room temperature, that is the fluidity factor that I talked about. Okay, then they do not undergo rancidity very easily, and they are very clear when you cool to 10 degrees Celsius. Now, if you have some injectable which requires refrigeration, okay, in that case this property becomes very important. Okay, so that they remain cool when so they remain clear when you're cooling it in the refrigerator at 10 degrees Celsius. Some of the oils, such as mineral oils and paraffins, they are not absorbed by the body tissue, and that is another reason why you use vegetable oils. You frequently use, whenever you are using oil, then vegetable oil is usually been preferred. So these are some of the examples, that is ethyl alcohol, glycols, and vegetable oils, which have been preferred when you are preparing the parental products. Okay, let us move ahead. This was all about the vehicles that have been used. Apart from vehicle, there are many other excipients that have been added inside. Vehicle that you add inside a parental preparation is the antibacterial agent. Okay, so what are antibacterial agents? Antibacterial agents are the agents which stop the production of the or growth of bacteria inside any formulation. What does this bacteria do? They cause instability inside the preparation. Okay, for other preparations I'm talking about, that is for suspension or emulsion, they cause instability. In parental preparation, definitely they are going to have instability in the preparation. Moreover, parental preparations are given to what? They are given to inside the blood circulation. Hence, the antibacterial agents become very, very important. Okay, they are usually packed in multiple dose vials, because in multiple dose vials, what is being done is, if you have a multiple dose vial, in multiple dose vials, you remove the ingredient from it, and the so there is puncturing of this closure. So you have a closure over here, and this closure is been punctured with your syringe, right? So there are chances that some bacteria may enter into this sterile preparation. This preparation is sterile. When you are manufacturing it, and when you are giving it to the when you are selling it off, that time this preparation is very sterile in nature. But in multiple dose unit, what you multiple in single dose, what you do is you remove it and you give it immediately to the patient. It may not happen. But in case of multiple dose units, what you do is you puncture it, okay? You remove the content, and after removing the content, you keep the container as such till the next patient comes, okay? In the meanwhile, there are chances that bacteria may grow inside it. Hence, antibacterial agents are very important when you are using a multiple dose vials, okay? Or also, when the formulation, if this formulation is sterilized by marginal processes, okay, they are not very well sterilized. Okay, in that case also there are chances that the microbes may grow inside it. Okay, that time also you are going to go for antimicrobial agents. Or if you are if there is some manipulation in the aseptic condition, so you have your premises, and in that premises the totally application that is being done in your premises. In that case, also what you can do is you can go for adding of this antibacterial agent inside your formulation. The examples of antibacterial agents that have been used are benzyl alcohol, benzalkonium chloride, butyl paraben, chlorobutanol, metacresol, methyl paraben, propyl paraben, phenols. Okay, then aerosol. Okay, so these are the different antibacterial agents that can be used. Let us see a okay. Let us move further with the next ingredient that has been added after antibacterial agent. Other agents that can be added are antioxidants. What do the antioxidants do? Antioxidant prevents oxidation of the substances, okay, of the active ingredient or of the excipients also. So the drugs or API which are susceptible to oxidation, okay, in those cases you are going to use antioxidants. Many a times a drug may not be susceptible to oxidation as such, but remember, whenever you are preparing an parental preparation, these parental preparations, after they are manufactured, they are subjected to sterilization. And when you are sterilizing it, the temperature is increased, because it is usually the sterilization of thermal sterilization. Therefore, the temperature has been increased. Many a times at this high temperature, many products may be susceptible to oxidation. Okay, so that also you have to consider. Now, how do this antioxidant act? They act in different ways. First, they undergo preferential oxidation. These are known as reducing agents. So what do these agents do? Okay, so these are the substances which themselves undergo oxidation. So what do these substances do? They undergo themselves oxidation. So they are present along with the formulation. So you have the formula, and inside the formula, what you have is you have these ingredients that are present. Okay, you have this antioxidants that are present. So whenever there is oxygen, okay, so whenever there is O2 that comes in contact with the formulation, these substances, these antioxidants, okay, first they react with this oxygen because they undergo preferential oxidation, right? So they are prone to oxidation themselves. So what is protected? Your formulation is protected because these substances themselves go oxidation. Okay, examples of these are ascorbic acid, sodium metabisulfite, sodium bisulfite, okay, thiourea. So these are some of the examples of this antioxidants. The second type of antioxidants are they block the oxidative change. Okay, So whatever is the oxidation reaction that is going to happen, so that chain, you have seen that there is a chain of reaction that happens. So that chain is being blocked by this preparation, okay, by these antioxidants. Examples are ascorbic acid, BHT, that is butylated hydroxytoluene, tocopherols. So these are the agents which block the oxidative chain, right? The third type of ingredients are which themselves are not oxidants, okay, they themselves are not antioxidants, but they help the antioxidants to perform their function, okay. So they are known as synergistic, okay. These synergistic, when added along with the antioxidants, they increase the effectiveness of the antioxidants, okay. Again, the examples are ascorbic acid, citric acid, okay, phosphoric acid, tartaric acid. So these are the ingredients which increases the effectiveness of antioxidants. There are other agents, okay, which forms complexes with the catalyst that accelerates the oxidation reaction. So there may be some agents which may be present over here, and these agents, what they are doing is they are increasing the rate of oxidation. So what you do is you add catalyst over here, okay. So the catalysts are added over here. Now these catalysts, what they do is they club with this, okay. They're going to club with this agent, right? So this clubbing of agent, this chelation is going to take place. So the complex formation is going to take place with this agent. So now these agents which were going to accelerate the oxidative reaction, those are getting catalyzed, right? They are getting complex at form. So they become what? So they become inactive in nature, and hence they do not show any action, right? So they form complexes with the catalyst that accelerates the oxidation reaction. Examples are the chilling agents, for example, EDTA. The another method which we are also going to see further is the displacing of oxygen. So if you want to block the oxidation reaction, this is not true antioxidants, but if you want to block the oxidation reaction, then what you can do is, so whatever the container you have, from this container, some amount of oxygen is going to be present over here, right? So these are your powders, and apart from powders, there is going to be some gap that is going to remain on the top. This gap is going to be filled with what? Oxygen. So what you do is you remove this oxygen with the help of some inert substances, that is nitrogen or carbon dioxide, and this nitrogen or carbon dioxide is now not going to show any action with the drug that is present over here, okay. So this displacement of your oxygen with nitrogen or carbon dioxide is another method to stop oxidation. But please remember, this is not antioxidant. This is another to form to block the oxidation reaction, okay. Moving further, the next ingredients that are used inside the parental preparations are buffers, okay. So what do the buffers do? The buffers maintain the pH. Why should we maintain the pH? If the pH is not maintained, okay, then it may also lead to change in pH, may lead to the increasing rate of reaction, okay. Which type of reaction? The reaction which are degradative in nature, the reaction which degrades your API, okay. Those reactions may be increased, okay, at what? At because of change in pH. So this change in pH may increase the degradative reaction, and hence you have to maintain the pH, and this maintaining of pH is done by, right? Got it? Now this change in pH can occur when? It can occur during storage. So where you have prepared the preparation and you are storing it, at that time the change in pH may happen. In order to block the change in pH, you are going to use buffer. What does the buffer do? Buffer does not allow the pH to be changed. It maintains the pH of the particular preparation. Now, why does the change in pH occur during storage? The reason is, one of the reason is because of the dissolution of the glass constituents. So you have a glass container. These glass container, the constituents of these glass containers may be mixed with the product, right? That may cause the change in pH. It may be because of the rubber closure or the plastic component. Sometimes it is been packed in plastic, so it may be because of the plastic components. Okay, it may be because of the rubber closure. So you have rubber closure over here on the top. The preparation comes in contact with the rubber closure, and the constituents of rubber closure may also change your pH of your formulation, right? And if the change in pH of formulation happens, then degradative reactions may take place, right? That's why you have buffers. The another reason for change of pH may be because of the dissolution of gases and vapors that are present over here. So here at the top, there are some gases and vapors that are present, as I told you earlier, right? Because of these gases and vapors that are present over here on the top, because of this also your product may have change in pH, right? So that time also what you are going to do is you have to use buffer in order to avoid the change in pH. It may be because of the diffusion of rubber or plastic component, which I already talked about. So you have rubber over here, you have a plastic container, so there may be diffusion from the rubber or the plastic component, and it may be also because of the reaction within the product. So there may be some reaction that is going to happen within the product. Because of that also there may be change in pH. What are the different buffer systems that are used? You have studied it very well in your inorganic chemistry, organic and inorganic chemistry. Those are acetate buffers, citrate buffers, phosphate buffers, any type of buffers whichever is suitable for your formulation, those can be used. So the selection of these buffer, on what you going to select these acetate, citrate or phosphate buffer, which one you are going to choose, is based upon the effective range, upon the concentration, and it also depends upon the chemical effect. So depending upon these, you are going to choose a buffer. Okay, why you are going to choose a buffer? Because of all these things, because of all these reasons, there might be change in pH, and if there is change in pH, then it is going to cause the degradative reaction, whereby your API is going to degrade, right? It is not going to remain stable, which I talked about yesterday. So the stability has been lost, and hence what you do is you use the buffers as an additive in the in the parental products. Okay, these are some of the examples of buffers that are used in the parental preparation. For example, acetic acid, their quantity is also given over here. Adipic acid, citric acid, lactic acid, malic acid, okay, sodium carbonate, tartaric acid. So these are some of the buffers that can be used. I have already talked about you already know about the different types of buffer, that's acetate, citrate, and phosphate buffers, and the method of preparation of it. Okay. Moving to the next ingredient that is being used is the chelating agents. Now, what does this chelating agent do? These chelating agents, they mix with your heavy metals, isn't it? And they form chelation reaction with the heavy metals. Now, why do you want the heavy metals to be chelated? Because again, these heavy metals, just like buffers, they also catalyze the degradative reactions. Okay, so these degradative reactions that are happening inside the formulation, these are getting catalyzed because of the presence of heavy metals. So these heavy metals have to be blocked. And what is the best way of blocking these heavy metals? By the use of chelating agent. So what does the chelating agent do? This chelating agent reacts with this heavy metal. It causes the chelation reaction, and thereby these heavy metals are now not free to bind with the or to carry out this catalyzation of your API. So this chelating agent binds with the free heavy metals. From where do these heavy metals come? The heavy metals are extracted from the rubber closure. Okay, and hence one of the examples of chelating agent is one of the examples is our case study is thimerosal. Okay, so thimerosal, if you remember, it is a bacteriostatic agent. If you remember, it is used as an antibacterial agent. It's the example of antibacterial agent. This thimerosal, okay, this is unstable in the presence of cupric ions, right? So where is this thimerosal present? this thiomersal is present in the formulation. So in the formulation, thiomersal is present as one of the ingredient, as one of the additive. This thiomersal is present. Are you getting me? So now this thiomersal is reacting with cupric ion. So whatever cupric ions, if they are present over here, then it is going to react with the cupric ion. And because of this reaction with cupric ion, this thiomersal is now going to become inactive in nature. Right? If this thiomersal becomes inactive, then what it is not going to show? It is not going to show its bacteriostatic action. If it does not show its bacteriostatic action, then what is going to happen? Bacteria are going to grow inside this formulation, right? And it is going to, and this thiomersal, it is used in poliomyelitis vaccine. In polio vaccine, this has been used. Okay. So what is going to happen? This polio vaccine is now going to get degraded, and the antigenicity of this vaccine is going to get lost. Are you understanding it? So what does this chelating agent do? These some PDTA chelating agent, what do? They basically stabilizes the thiomersal, whereby this thiomersal is now going to show its action, that is the bacteriostatic action. And as it shows its bacteriostatic action, therefore this polio vaccine is not going to get destroyed. Okay, so this is one of the examples of how the chelating agents are acting. Examples are EDTA sodium, di-EDTA, trisodium EDTA, tetrasodium EDTA, calcium disodium EDTA. So these are the different examples of chelating agent. Going on further, we have already talked about the inert gases. So inert gases can also be used. These inert gases, what they do is they basically remove the oxygen that is present at the top. Okay, so it displaces the oxygen from the solution. So what you do is you add these inert substances, that is basically nitrogen or carbon dioxide has been added. So when you add nitrogen or carbon dioxide inside the formulation, oxygen is getting removed from it. If oxygen is getting removed from it, then oxidative changes in the formulations are being solution. So inert gases are pumped inside the parenteral solution. So you have parenteral solution. Inside the parenteral solution, you are pumping this inert gases. Okay. Let us take an example of sodium bicarbonate injection. Okay. Sodium bicarbonate, when you are autoclaving it, okay, it gets converted into sodium carbonate, carbon dioxide, and water. Right? This happens basically during the process of autoclaving. So what you know is sodium bicarbonate is saturated with carbon dioxide. So if you saturate this, then it's going to inhibit the reaction that is taking place. That is, sodium bicarbonate is not going to convert into sodium carbonate. It's not going to convert into carbon dioxide and water. This reaction is going to get blocked. Okay, as I've shown over here, this reaction gets blocked, and sodium bicarbonate with this preparation is been protected because of the presence of inert gas, and the inert gas is nothing but carbon dioxide. Because of the presence of this inert gas, sodium bicarbonate has been protected. So inert gas can also be added as an additive to your preparation. The next type of ingredients that are used are protein stabilizers. What they basically do is they stabilizes the protein. Okay. Now, if you take an example of serum albumin, okay. Now, this serum albumin basically competes with a therapeutic protein, right? And thereby, the loss of your actual protein, the loss of your therapeutic protein is getting prevented because of the presence of this serum albumin. So what is happening is just like that was happening in the case of your antioxidants. So here also, to this therapeutic protein, what you add is serum albumin, which is also a protein. And now, when if the destabilization of protein has to take place, then serum albumin will get destabilized, whereas your therapeutic protein is going to get protected. Right? Are you understanding this? And that's why the loss of your therapeutic protein is being minimized over here. Right? Understood? Now, the viral contamination in there is a viral contamination in this natural substances, such as serum albumin, etc. When you're using this preparation, that time the viral contamination is a major factor. Okay, for example, in albumin or in some other kind of substances, right? Hence, other type of substances that stabilizes the protein are being investigated. For example, hetastarch. Hetastarch is one of the proteins, okay, which are added to the protein preparation, which itself undergoes competitive binding and protects your therapeutic protein. Okay. Now, another thing that you have to remember is there are a number of types of substances, for example, cryoprotectants and lyoprotectants, which are also used, okay, to minimize the protein denaturation during freeze drying process. This you must have studied in great detail when you studied about cryoprotectants and lyoprotectants, right? So, these can also be added, cryoprotectants and lyoprotectants can also be added when you are doing freeze drying process, okay. The examples of some of the proteins include polyhydric alcohol, amino acids, non-reducing sugars, polymers, okay, surface active agents, and antioxidants. Okay, some of the examples of polyhydric alcohol are sorbitol, glycerol, polyethylene glycol. Some of the examples of amino acids are glycine, okay, lysine, glutamine. Some of the examples for protein stabilizers in the form of non-reducing sugar are trehalose or sucrose. Polymers such as dextran, polyvinyl pyridine (PVP), or methylcellulose can be used. Surface active agents, for example, poloxamer 188, polysorbate 80 or 20, polysorbate 80 or polysorbate 20. These can be used. Or you can also use antioxidants. You can also use buffers, or also you can also use chelating agent in order to stabilize the protein. If your preparation is a protein preparation, if your formulation is a protein formulation containing protein, then you have to add protein stabilizers in order to stabilize the protein. And basically, they act by undergoing preferential destabilization. Okay, so these ingredients that you have added, they undergo preferential destabilization, whereby the protein which is having therapeutic value is being protected from destabilizing. Okay,